So basically, as Ryong said, it's much, or to put it very simply, it's a lot easier to get to somewhere if you know where you want to go. So the more specific you can be about what it is that you want to achieve, the easier it is to actually find out what is needed to achieve it. So that's the whole idea behind becoming more specific about the goals and targets for adaptation. We saw in one of the previous presentations that, and I think that's repeated numerous times in the UNFCCC negotiations, that the goal for adaptation is to increase resilience or reduce vulnerability. And while that is fine as an overall goal, it has very little sort of operational guidance. So if we can say, and specifically we want to do this, that, or the other, we're going to have a much greater chance of actually doing something that helps us in getting somewhere. So this has all been said by Ryong, so please press it. We also see that we often have the organization into capacity, technology, and investment finance needs. And also, as Ryong said, you can look at what can be provided domestically and where you need international support. So that's just following up from Ryong's. So just a few examples of the submitted INDCs, and the one from Ethiopia actually categorizes required support into this unsupported and supported contributions. So what is going to be done domestically and where's additional support needed from the outside external assistance. In a way, that's quite similar to what people are doing or countries are doing on mitigation, where you see sort of unconditional and conditional mitigation actions. So in that sense, you can see this on adaptation as an equivalent. What will we do on our own, and where do we need additional support in order to actually achieve what we've stated in our INDC on adaptation? Some few more examples on capacity needs, how they have been specified in the INDCs that have been submitted so far. So you can see Morocco. It's quite broad, not very specific, not very quantitative. And there are a few examples from Mexico. Again, on technologies, and I think I'm not going to go into detail on this because that is basically what Sara is also going to talk about. But you can see that's more detailed in terms of the type of support needed for different technology needs. And then on investment and finance needs, you actually see quite a few of the, well, I'm talking as if there's a large sample, but there are a few of the submitted INDCs covering adaptation where it's specified how much is actually spent in the country right now on addressing adaptation needs, how much is needed, and then how much support is needed. And in some of these cases, a next step is then indicated as providing additional detail on what the cost implications are and what the needs for international investment and finance is. So that's basically it. We also wanted to give you the opportunity, if you had any questions also to Ryong's presentation, to ask them now. And then after that, we will give the floor to Sara, one of our colleagues who works a lot on technology and technology needs assessment prioritization, to give a more detailed example of that. So any questions? Yes?
In regards to the table that you put up on prioritizing, you had stated that the confidence was based on the IPCC. In regards to the significance and the urgency, what was that based upon? Like, how did they come up with that? Thank you.
Basically, the significance this is taken from the Japanese NAP process, and they actually, I think they might have published their NAP now. So on significance, it was in terms of social and economic and environmental significance for the country. So more in terms of sustainable development significance. And the urgency is more to do with the timing. Is it something we need to address right now? Or is it something that is important, but maybe in a slightly longer time frame? So it could help you see what are the links to national development priorities, when do we need to act? Is it something, and that can also help if you're formulating, over the next 5 years, we will focus on this, that, and the other. And then from 2020, we will focus on something that's important, significant, but less urgent right now. So it's more to help you with the timing perspective as well. We can provide you, there's an example in our guidance note as well on this, but we can also see if we can find the link to the Japanese NAP. And I have a copy of a presentation that they made. The danger here, which we also saw in the Japanese case, is if you end up with everything being very significant, very urgent, and very high confidence, then it's difficult to prioritize. But of course, that also tells a story about the urgency of adaptation and of climate change. Any other questions? If not, then I'll give the mic to Sara. Sara, do you want to stand or sit? Stand.
So, good afternoon. My name is Sara. I'm a senior researcher here at the UDP, and most of my work is focused on technologies for adaptation. I work a lot on the Technology Needs Assessment project. I was involved in phase 1, which ended 2 years back, and now I'm involved in phase 2 of the TNA project, Technology Needs Assessment. And I am coordinating, I'm responsible for the overall coordination of implementation of the project in Africa region and Middle East. And today I would like to give you an introduction to how we suggest countries to prioritize both among key sectors and also among key technologies. But as mentioned before, how we see technologies for this project is, especially for adaptation mainly, embracing close to what you would call adaptation options mainly. Yes. So I'll give you an introduction to the methodology, the multi-criteria analysis, and I'll give you some examples of how Lebanon and Mauritius approached it. So why do we actually suggest countries to use multi-criteria analysis? Well, it gives the opportunity of comparing a number of options against criteria selected by stakeholders and national experts. As have been said several times, the more focused and you could say define the area that you are focusing on is, the easier, so to say, it is to select the options that you would actually prioritize among. It facilitates the participation of stakeholders and national experts, and it incorporates the technical expertise when you actually evaluate and prioritize these adaptation options. And lastly, but not least, it gives you an alternative to approaches where you would need good, sufficient, a large amount of data, which would be needed, for example, when making cost-benefit analysis or cost efficiency comparison of different adaptation options. So how we approach the MCA, the multi-criteria analysis, is that, as you have also heard before, establish a decision context. And this is making the basis for identifying the various options that you would actually prioritize among. At the same time as the decision context also provides the framing for how you will identify the criteria that you would actually assess the adaptation options against. Then after the 2 steps of identify options, identify criteria, which can be done similarly, then you move on to the scoring of the options against each of the criteria. Some countries choose to give equal weights to each of the criteria, equal importance, but other approaches would be to give more significance to one criteria compared to the other criteria. Assume that you have a big cake, you have 8 criteria, you need to divide this cake into 8 pieces, but some of the pieces might be bigger than the other, you could say. So you combine the scores with the weights for the criteria, and you examine the results. But I will give you a bit more details on this. And this is mainly just to outline the activities. I guess you will have it in the presentations that you will receive on your email. But these are mainly the activities involved in each steps of the methodology. Coming back to this, you have heard that several times before, so I don't need to go into much detail with that. But for the technology needs assessment project, we would suggest that you have a few focus areas, and within these focus areas you could actually even narrow down what you would actually like to focus on, because that makes it even easier to select your options compared to having a very broad objective. And again, for the approach that we are taking, it's up to the consultant or the national expert to narrow down the objectives based on existing efforts in the country, national development priorities, but also to discuss with the key relevant stakeholders within your focus areas. So how do you actually define or identify the criteria that you assess these adaptation options against? Well, what we suggest is that you would have a working group of stakeholders within the focus area that you have selected. And again, derive the criteria based on objectives and goals defined in the decision context, but also to be aware that the representation of stakeholders within the group that you are actually selecting criteria with would actually represent a broad, you could say they should be not only from the Ministry of Agriculture or from the water sector. It has to be, it could, or we suggest it would be also including, for example, people from the financing sector, which would also have a say in what would be important. Yes. So I will just give you a brief overview of the prioritization in Lebanon for this technology needs assessment project and the criteria that they chose. So for criteria, they had vulnerability to climate change. They had adaptive capacity. They had, was this adaptation technology or option a national priority? What was the socioeconomic importance? That could, for example, be, do this option create any employment opportunities? Then they had a criteria saying, okay, to which extent can this option contribute to actually make a change? They had a availability. Is this technology or this adaptation option available in the country? If it is not available, how can we access this? And is it even feasible? And then they had also, of course, the cost of adaptation, which would also be judged based on, does it require significant, for example, transfer of technologies, or is it a low-cost technology or option which is mainly inducing a change in behavior, for example? Not yet. And as you can see here, based on these criteria, they did select the water sector and also the agricultural sector as their key priority sectors to focus on in the TNA project. And just to illustrate, then they moved on to focus more in depth for these two sectors for adaptation. They also had two sectors for mitigation. But for the water sector, they then went on to identify more specific criteria to actually prioritize among the options in the sector, which also, of course, would depend on their national circumstances. So they had more specifically cost of adaptation option. And then it's, of course, important to focus on, okay, should this be per unit? Should it be per potential beneficiary? That's also important to consider when you choose your criteria. They had criteria which are very specific to the water sector, for example, to increase water supply and water capacity, capacity to increase water efficient use, extent of application, again, how many potential beneficiaries would there be for this option? If it's only a limited user group, then it might not be relevant to focus more on this option in this context. Then they had a criteria on need for knowledge and human resources. If there was a large need for knowledge on this specific option, it could be okay, but it's something to consider, and it also requires some more spending, you could say, in terms of capacity building. And that also is valid for the need for required infrastructure, which is also would include, for example, the capacity of institutions to facilitate or diffuse this option. Then the social acceptance of the option, if it's even feasible to the potential beneficiary group. You could say, okay, we have potentially 200,000 users in the country, but do they actually think this is something that they would use? And if not, then this would further require some awareness raising. And then they also included negative environmental impacts of the technologies as one of their criteria. Okay. So based on these criteria, they scored and ranked a number of adaptation technologies, or we could call them options, for the water sector. And as you can see here, it came out with a quite clear result, where the top one, which is also, of course, depending on the local context, for Lebanon, was rainwater harvesting from greenhouses, and actually from their roofs, of course. And then they had rainwater harvesting from roads, water user associations, etc. And then after this prioritization process in the technology needs assessment project, they went further on to analyze barriers to why is this technology not diffused in the country. It could be an existing technology, but there were no users. And how could we actually remove the barriers to the use of the technology? And then the countries went further to suggest technology action plans. And some of the countries who are now preparing INDCs would maybe have their technology plans, action plans, prepared already. So I would suggest to have a look into what you have in your country. Okay. And then we move on to Mauritius, starting with their sector prioritization. And they based their sector prioritization both on recent vulnerability assessments and sectors identified through programs, Africa Adaptation Program, their national development priorities, but also, and I think that is also quite relevant and to emphasize, the sectoral political support. So would there be political will to actually do something to increase the efforts within this sector? And based on this, they actually selected 3 sectors: water, agriculture, and coastal zone, which is a huge issue for Mauritius. Okay, so this is just to illustrate how it could be done, and this is for the agricultural sector in Mauritius. They had, you could say, some key groups of criteria, and then more specific indicators, and you could even also call them criteria. That is how it's done sometimes. And they split it into institutional implementation barriers, public financing needs, economic, environmental, climate, social, political. So they actually quite covered most of, say, what could be relevant in terms of criteria. But what I would also illustrate here is that one of the main advantages of the multi-criteria analysis is that it can actually include both criteria where you have data. For example, this one, public financing need. They could actually, for each of the options, estimate additional cost of per beneficiary per year, but they could include this in the analysis with some stakeholder judgments for all the other criteria, where they said, okay, for some of the options we can find data, but for some we cannot. So therefore we actually base our prioritization on the expert's judgment. So this is happening in a workshop setting, for example, where you say, okay, what is the ease of implementation of this technology? And then the stakeholders value between 1 to 5. 1 is very difficult, then you have 2, 3, 4, 5, and 5 is very easy. So it actually saves a lot of resources in the process of prioritization. If you can list criteria, list your options, and then you go to a stakeholder setting and make this, these discussions about how you would judge each option against each criteria. And one thing which is important to note here is also that, of course, the experts would need to have, you cannot expect the experts to have equal information, full information on all the options that you are prioritizing among. So it's the responsibility of the expert to have prepared a fact sheet or an information sheet for each of the options which are to be prioritized among during the workshop. Okay. So in Mauritius, they came to the following results. Reforestation of the water catchment area as one, upscaling of locally proven IPM technologies for control of pests, and micro-irrigation as the third one. But then they went back in their working group, can switch, and said they discussed the results, and based on these discussions, they actually took out the first ranked option, because they were actually saying, okay, but this option is already receiving such a lot of funding from our government, so we don't think it would be, we think it would be better to focus on the other options, since we can do a better work there. The first option is already attracting so much attention, funding, but if we focus on the next options, we could actually make a bigger difference than when we focus on the first option. And this is mainly what we recommend to use in this technology needs assessment project as a tool for prioritizing both sectors and options. And you can find much more information on the tool. On our website, we have a guidance note for how to prioritize adaptation technologies, but it's just as good for technology options. No, adaptation options. And it's prepared by my colleague Ryong and me. And it goes through all the steps in the prioritization exercise. And we also have an Excel sheet or tool, if you would like, which gives you the options of putting in the scores and the weights, and then it does the calculation for you. Unfortunately, it's not available through the website yet, but if you write me or Ryong an email, I'm sure we can send it to you. And if you're interested, and I would strongly suggest that, I think you should take a look on our website and check if your country has already done a TNA, or if they are actually involved in the new phase that we are starting up now. And I know that a few of the countries are involved in it, like Mauritania, Burundi, Mozambique, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and maybe a few others. And Rwanda was part of the first phase of TNA, so they would have a report available already.
Perhaps if there are any questions, please, you might want to have headphones on here.
Merci pour l'exposé. J'espère qu'on va vous joindre par email pour avoir l'Excel pour l'analyse multicritère. Donc, j'ai remarqué que pour l'analyse, vous avez fixé d'abord des critères, et puis à partir de critères, il y avait les scores et le weighting, c'est-à-dire la pondération. Dans vos critères, j'ai vu les scores, les critères, mais je n'ai pas vu la pondération. Et là, je veux vous poser des questions sur la pondération. Est-ce qu'on fait des coefficients de pondération sur les critères, ou bien il y a une autre manière, quand on prend l'agriculture, il y a des filières et des sous-secteurs dans l'agriculture, on fait des pondérations pour ces secteurs. Quelle est la vision la plus juste? Est-ce que c'est clair? OK.
So the weighting is made for, it could be, you can do it, there are two ways. You can do it for each category of criteria or for each subcategory of criteria. So if you have, for example, 5 categories, you could say it has to add up to 5 categories of criteria. So you could have 2 criteria for one category and 3 criteria for another criteria category. And then you could say, you could put weights for each criteria category. And then within the category, you can distribute this, let's say 20% weight, to the sub-criteria. Is that, yes?
I have the small question. I want to know how to assign the score.
So there are 2 ways. One is to get the data. You can have data for each criteria. You could say, okay, this criteria I will evaluate based on actual data. Number of beneficiaries. That would be actual data. But for the same criteria, you could also say, we actually don't know, but we base this on expert judgment. So how many potential beneficiaries do these experts, which I trust, and they know our local national context, so they can actually make the judgment.
Non, je dis que s'il n'y a pas d'experts qui connaissaient très bien notre réalité, quel est l'autre chemin
Then the other way would be data, right? Because you could also say, okay, would it be the responsibility of the consultant or national expert to make this judgment? You could say, okay, this is the only way we can do it within the time frame and the resources that we have. But the result would be more robust if you have more stakeholders included.
Merci. Moi, je voudrais réfléchir un peu sur la place de l'éducation. Est-ce qu'on peut considérer l'éducation comme étant un secteur, un critère au niveau de l'adaptation? Vous avez consulté beaucoup de CPDN. Est-ce que certains pays ont évoqué l'éducation? J'ai vu le cas de la Mauritanie, par exemple. En termes de critères, on a fait... Donc, parmi les critères, il y a l'environnement. Et dans les indicateurs, c'est des initiatives liées aux services écosystémiques. Là, j'étais en train de penser à l'éducation. Bref, ma question à moi, quelle est la place qu'on peut attribuer à l'éducation dans le processus d'adaptation dans la composante adaptation au changement climatique.
Yes, thank you. There would be a criteria for, you could say, training potential. How many people would benefit from this option and how many people could be trained in using it. You could also say if it's an option which is not existing in the country, or if it's a relatively new option, then there would be some more potential for training since not many people would know it. And you could include that as a criteria. But how much weight you put on this criteria is very much up to what you find appropriate within your context. So you could even put up to 30% if you think that's appropriate weight to this criteria. So the higher weight to the criteria, the more significant or the more influence you think this criteria should have on the selection of options. So if this is identified within your national context as very important, then I would suggest you to put a high weightage on this criteria.
Okay. I think the main concern is who have the responsibility to use this tool, the community or the expertise, because the judgment is very important. If this tool we have to use in the community, and we have to do with the stakeholders, maybe they have to be the ones who have to judge which way they want to give, or which way they want to give. So I'm a bit confused about that. So it have to be this tool is for the community to use it or for the expertise.
The tool is for the expert to use. We have this MCA adaptation guidance, and it goes through all the steps, and it lists where it would be relevant to include stakeholders in the process. So I think that would clarify where to bring in stakeholders and how to come about the different steps. What is done is that it is the expert who prepares the list of options. Then it's discussed with the stakeholders. It could be that they would have some alternative suggestions or additional suggestions. Then you can decide together with the stakeholders, okay, this is our final list, which we will prioritize among. Then you discuss the criteria that you will evaluate these options against with the stakeholders as well. It could be the national expert which prepares the list. That would ease the process, is my experience, that you have something prepared. Then you have, okay, these are the criteria that I would suggest. Can we discuss these criteria? Do you have anything to add, or is there anything we should leave out? Then you have decided on the criteria. Then you need to decide on the weights. And then you can go on with the scoring. And when you have the scoring and the criteria and weights decided with the stakeholders, the expert can go back and do the calculation in his or her own office. It doesn't have to be within the stakeholder setting. You do the calculations, you come back with the results, ask the stakeholders, do you agree on this? Like in the case with Mauritius, where the stakeholders said, okay, it's a very important option, but we have so many efforts within this area already, so we would actually prefer to look at option 2, 3, and 4.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. So we have an hour left, and to just give a break to our interpreter, we thought we would just go straight to the exercise so we can stand up out of our chairs and move around a bit. And the exercise is about this prioritization matrix. And this, of course, is not meant to be your final prioritization matrix of gaps and barriers, but maybe exercising our brains and walking around a bit. I've created this quadrant, which is basically looking at the ease of removal. Is this easy to remove on your own? or is it as in here, or is it very difficult to remove, so the ease of removal is low? Is it important that you get rid of this barrier or you address this gap to reach your adaptation target, or is it not? So now I would just like to give you a chance to perhaps come with 2 examples for each quadrant, or even just one. Just have a look, and we'll post a flip chart on each wall. Please write the name of your country, the main gap you're facing, and where you think that it fits, whether it's in this quadrant, this quadrant, this quadrant, or this quadrant. Is that okay? No. Should we give it a go?
Maybe give us an example.
Okay, so sorry. As we've discussed in our groups, and we're talking about some of the adaptation targets that we have. For instance, a lot of the commonalities that we shared in our group, for example, was enhancing resilience or reducing vulnerability. We've got current actions which are aimed towards that. You might have some food security programs or early warning systems already developed. Okay, that's what you've got currently. What else do you need to get there? What is your gap to actually reach the enhancement of resilience in all the communities? So let's just be imaginative here. What else could we think of that we'd need to actually put in place in terms of actions to actually get here? And then you can think about where that comes in, all right? So for instance, to enhance resilience, we also need to have a lot of, capacity building of different ministries, for example. So how important is that in the whole scheme of things in achieving the overall target of enhancing resilience? Is it very important? Is it not very important? Is it something that we can do ourselves, or is the capacity not even there that we need to ask for it externally? That's one example. So just a bit of a brainstorm at this moment, and it won't be a long exercise. It's mainly to just start thinking in these terms of what could actually inform your needs here.